buried my wife at 2:30, and by 5 o'clock my key didn't fit my own front door. I remember that better than I remember the preacher's sermon, better than the lilies around the casket, better than the ride out to Hillcrest Cemetery with Janice talking too much in the front seat and the funeral home sedan, smelling faintly of Armor All and old coffee. What stayed with me was the lock, the small hard stop of metal where home ought to have opened. But that came later. First, there was the church basement. We'd gone back to First Methodist after the graveside the way people do in towns like ours. Folding tables, ham biscuits under plastic wrap, green beans gone soft in crock pots. Somebody had brought a pecan pie Ruth always liked, though by then the top had sweated under the lid and gone shiny. I stood there with a paper plate in one hand and a cup of weak coffee in the other, saying thank you to people I'd known 30 years, some of them longer. Men from the school district shook my hand too hard. Women touched my forearm with 2 fingers and told me Ruth had been a light. That part I could manage. There are things a man learns to do without thinking. You stand straight. You say that's kind of you. You don't talk too long. You let people mean well. It was Janice who made the room feel wrong. She was my younger sister by 5 years, 66, and trim and organized in a navy dress she'd probably bought for the occasion 2 days after Ruth went into hospice. Janice had a way of stepping half a foot ahead of wherever a thing was happening. If someone asked me whether I was eating, she answered first. If somebody from church asked whether I wanted help with the thank you cards later, she said, "We'll make sure that gets handled." Not I. We. I noticed it the first time and told myself she was nervous. I noticed it the 4th time and felt something old stir under my ribs. That was the old thing with Janice. She'd been deciding what kind of man I was since we were children. I was the brother who stayed close to home, the one who fixed our mother's porch steps and drove our father to appointments and took the practical jobs that kept a roof overhead. Janice had always spoken about me in a tone that sounded almost kind if you didn't listen too close. Walt means well. Walt's steady. Walt's not one for details. Then Ruth came into my life at 29 with her clear eyes and sensible shoes and her way of putting a hand on my back when a room got crowded and something in the family story shifted. They never said it plain, but the message was there. Ruth had polished me up. Ruth had made me more presentable to the world. None of that seemed worth revisiting with my wife dead 4 days. Still, I noticed. At one point, I was standing near the coffee urn when old Frank Dalrymple asked whether I'd be staying out at the house alone tonight. Before I could say yes, Janice said, "We're working that out. He's had about all he can take today." Frank gave me that look people give when they're not sure whether to keep treating you like yourself. I said, "I'm going home." Janice smiled without looking at me and straightened a stack of napkins. "We'll see how you feel once you sit down." "We'll see." I did not like the sound of that. David, her husband, hovered nearby with his hands in his jacket pockets, nodding at nobody in particular. David had spent 40 years standing just outside Janice's weather. Good man, mostly. Weak in the places that mattered. My niece Kelly came over with a foil pan and asked if I wanted leftovers. Before I could answer, Janice said, "Put a little aside, but not too much. He won't keep up with it." That stung more than it should have. Maybe because Ruth had spent half her sick months making lists on the yellow pad by the phone so I'd know what soup froze well and which neighbor to return casseroles to in their own dishes. Maybe because I had fed my wife with my own hands, that Spring kept track of her medicines down to the half-hour washed sheets at midnight when she was too embarrassed to let hospice do it. I had kept up with quite a lot, actually. I set my coffee down and said, "I can answer for myself, Jan." Her fingers paused on the napkins. Just for a second. Then she gave me that soft look people use on the newly bereaved, the kind that lets them get away with almost anything. "I know, honey," she said. "I'm just trying to make this easier." Nobody around us said a word. Plates shifted. A folding chair scraped concrete somewhere across the room. I stood there with my jaw tight and let it go, because there are moments in public when a man can feel himself being offered 2 roles, only the quiet old widower or the difficult one. I had no interest in giving Janice the second. So I took my coat from the back of the chair and told a few more people thank you and stepped out into the church parking lot just before 5. The March air had gone cold again by then. Indiana does that. Gives you one sod afternoon and takes it back by supper. My truck was parked under the bare sycamore by the fellowship hall. Ruth's funeral flowers were in the seat beside me, a little spray of white roses and eucalyptus from the casket blanket that the funeral director said I ought to take home. I set them down carefully and sat for a minute with both hands on the wheel. The quiet inside that truck was the first clean quiet I'd had all day. Ruth and I had lived in the same white frame house on Maple Street for 42 years. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, narrow galley kitchen. She used to call a shoebox front porch with a swing I kept meaning to repaint. I could have driven there in my sleep. Every stop sign on the route had some memory hanging off it. The hardware store where she'd once marched in and returned a defective faucet faster than I would have. The Dairy Queen where we took our grandnieces in July. The little brick ranch where she used to drop off soup when Mrs. Clevenger's arthritis got bad. By the time I turned onto Maple, the sky had flattened to that gray-blue you get right before dark. I saw the boxes first. 3 bankers' boxes lined up on the porch under the light by the front door. My old work boots sat beside one of them untied, like someone had nudged them there with a foot. I parked crooked and got out without shutting the truck door all the way. For a second, I just stood in the yard looking at my own porch, waiting for the picture to make sense. I thought maybe somebody had brought over sympathy cards or photo albums from the church. Then I saw my blue flannel shirt folded wrong on top of the nearest box. The shirt Ruth hated because the cuff was always fraying and I would not throw it out. I walked up the steps and set the flowers down. There was a clean scrape around the deadbolt where the brass shone brighter than the rest. I put my key in. It turned halfway and stopped. I tried again, slower. Nothing. The front door opened from the inside before I could knock. Janice stood there in stockings, no coat like she belonged to the place more than the March air did. Behind her, I could hear cabinet doors and the low murmur of women's voices. My cousin Denise crossed the hallway carrying a stack of serving bowls from Ruth's dining room hutch. Janice put one hand on the edge of the door. "Walt," she said in that same quiet voice, "you got here quicker than I expected." I looked past her. "Why, doesn't my key work?" She glanced down like that was the smallest part of what I ought to be noticing. "I had Larry switch the lock this afternoon. Just for now." Larry was her son. He installed garage doors. I stared at her. "You did what?" She opened the door a little wider, but not all the way. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're trying to get some things settled before you have to look at all of it." "All of what, the house?" She said it gently. "The food, the medications, Ruth's things. You can't be here by yourself tonight in the shape you're in. The shape I was in." From where I stood, I could see straight through to the kitchen. Someone had taken the dish towel off the oven handle. The glass cake stand from the funeral table was on my counter. The back door stood open to the mudroom, letting in a strip of cold light. Denise was at the sink now, rinsing something. In my house, in Ruth's kitchen, like the day had ended and the cleanup had begun. I looked down at the boxes again. "My clothes are on the porch. We packed you a few things," Janice said. "Just enough for a couple nights. You can stay with me and David until you're steadier." I felt something go flat and still inside me then. Not loud, not hot, just still. "You packed me a bag," I said, "and changed my lock." Janice's face tightened just a little. "Walt, please. Everybody's worried about you." I looked past her again into the kitchen where Ruth's wooden recipe box was no longer beside the refrigerator where she had kept it for 30 years. Then Janice said very softly, like I was the one forgetting where I belonged, "You can't stay here tonight. You can't stay here tonight." For a second I thought I had misheard her. Not the words, the arrangement of them, the plainness. The fact that she could stand there in my doorway with my wife, not 6 hours in the ground, and say something like that, as if she were deciding whether I needed an extra blanket. Behind her, Denise shut a cabinet door. I looked at Janice and said, Move. She drew herself up a little, not much. Janice never needed much. Walt, don't do this on the porch. It's my porch. That landed. I saw it land. A small change around her mouth, like she'd tasted something bitter and did not intend to show it. David came into the hallway, then shoulders rounded inside his brown sport coat, his tie loosened. He looked from me to the boxes to Janice and back again. "Maybe we ought to slow down a minute," he said. Janice didn't look at him. "We are slowing down. That's the whole point." I bent and picked up the top box. It was lighter than I expected. Shirts, socks, my shaving kit from the upstairs bathroom. The zipper on the side pocket was half torn where it had snagged years ago on a motel drawer in Paducah. Ruth used to laugh every time she saw that tear because I'd sworn for 20 minutes over a $5 bag like it was a matter of national principle. I carried the box toward the door. Janice put out one hand. "No." I stopped so close to her I could smell her face powder and the cold cream she always wore at night. "No," I said. "You're upset. You need somebody with you." "My wife just died." "Of course I'm upset. We know that." That word again. We. I set the box down hard enough to make the porch boards jump. Denise froze in the kitchen. David cleared his throat and did nothing with it. "What exactly is this?" I asked. "Tell me plain." Janice took a breath like she was about to explain a medical procedure to somebody slow. "This is one night, maybe two. You come stay with us. Get some sleep. Let us deal with the perishables and the pills and the paperwork. Tomorrow we can talk like civilized people." I stared at her. "You changed my lock before we talked like civilized people." That was practical. "Was it?" "Yes." Her voice sharpened, then just enough to show the steel under it. "Because I knew if we waited until you got home, you'd plant yourself in that kitchen and refuse every kind of help." It hit me then, not as anger exactly, but as something colder. She had not done this in a rush. She had pictured me, pictured the hour I'd get back, pictured where I'd stand, pictured what I would say, and she had acted around me like a man in the room who no longer counted. I looked past her again. Denise had one of Ruth's Pyrex dishes in her hands, the blue one with the faded cornflower pattern. Ruth made scalloped potatoes in that dish every Easter, whether anyone asked for them or not. On the far end of the counter, somebody had stacked condolence cards in a neat little pile near the bread box. My bread box. Ruth hated clutter on that counter. Hated it. "Put that down," I said to Denise. She jumped a little. "I was only washing up." "Then wash your own dishes." Janice turned to her. "Go on in the dining room a minute." Denise set the dish down too carefully and slipped away with her eyes lowered as if I were the embarrassment here. That was another thing families know how to do. They can turn a man into his own disruption in less than 30 seconds. I wish I could say I had some grand speech ready. I didn't. I stood there with funeral dirt still in the cuffs of my pants and felt every year of my life with Janice stack up behind that doorway. Janice deciding at 14 that I was too soft to bargain for Dad's old tractor. Janice telling the hospital intake nurse when our mother fell in the driveway that I'd handle the insurance because Walt's good with the legwork. Janice at Christmases, birthdays, summer cookouts, speaking over me in that efficient little way of hers and me letting it slide because Ruth would press my knee under the table later and say, "Leave it, Walt. It's Janice being Janice." Ruth used to think peace was something you could keep paying into and maybe someday draw from. Maybe I did too. "I'm going inside," I said. Janice shook her head. "No." David made a small helpless motion with one hand. "Jan." She turned on him. "David, please, for once. For once." That told me more than she meant to tell. Then she faced me again and softened her voice back down. "Nobody is taking anything from you. We are trying to prevent you from making bad decisions while you're in no shape to make any." I laughed once. Couldn't help it. It came out ugly. What bad decision is that? I asked. Sleeping in my own bed. Her eyes flickered. Being alone. There are sentences that would sound loving from one mouth and insulting from another. Ruth said that to me once years back when I was down with the flu and trying to insist I could drive myself to urgent care. Don't be alone, Walt. That sounded like tenderness. Janice, saying it on my porch with my lock changed and my shirts in cardboard, sounded like a declaration of incompetence. I bent, picked up the box again and set it aside. Then I reached past her and put my hand on the inside knob. She blocked me with her body. That was the moment David finally stepped forward. Janice, he said quietly, this has gone far enough. She swung her head toward him so fast a strand of hair came loose by her temple. Has it? Yes. The silence after that was different. Not peace, not yet. But the room had shifted just enough for me to feel it. Janice saw it too. She folded her arms tight across herself and looked at me in a way I had not seen before. Not sisterly, not managing, appraising. Then she said, Fine. If you want to do this the hard way, we can. The hard way, I said. She turned and went to the dining room buffet. When she came back, she had a single sheet of paper and a pen. I drafted something simple, she said. Temporary authority, just for household decisions this week. Deliveries, access, cleaning, medications, any property concerns. It protects everybody. I looked at the page but did not take it. You drafted something. At David's office. David flinched. He sold farm equipment. Had an office, not a law practice. Which meant Janice had typed it up herself, probably this afternoon while I was standing at my wife's grave. Give me that, I said. She handed it over like she was doing me the courtesy. The paper shook a little in my hand. Not because I was weak. Because rage and grief do a poor job sharing a body. I read the first line. I, Walter Mercer, voluntarily authorize my sister Janice Holloway to act on my behalf. I stopped there. My behalf. The old wound came up so hard, then it almost took my breath. It was not just the porch, not just the lock. It was every year of being the man people assigned chores to, and then assumed had not understood the bigger thing. Every family decision that somehow arrived already half made. Every time Ruth had to say Walt's already handled that in a tone gentle enough not to embarrass me and sharp enough to make the room back off. Only Ruth was gone now, and Janice had counted on that. I looked up from the paper. You had this ready before I got home. She lifted one shoulder. I knew you'd resist being cared for. That was when I knew she did not mean well. Maybe some sliver of her believed she did. People like Janice always keep a sliver like that polished. But the thing itself was older, harder, meaner. She had been waiting years for a room where Ruth would not be standing beside me. I folded the paper once cleanly and handed it back. No. Her mouth tightened. Then, don't say nobody tried. Headlights swept across the front windows. A car door shut out by the curb. Janice looked toward the porch. Who on earth? A moment later there was a knock at the storm door. 3 firm taps, not hesitant, not social. David moved first this time. He opened the door and a woman I knew by sight but had only met twice stepped onto the porch in a camel coat with a leather file case tucked under one arm. Mr. Mercer, she said. I nodded. I'm Eleanor Pike, Janice said too quickly. This isn't a good time. Eleanor looked at her, then at me, then at the boxes on the porch and the changed deadbolt shining around the lock plate. Her eyes took in everything in one pass. I'm afraid, she said, it is exactly the time. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Set the file case on the hall table where Ruth kept the mail. Took off one glove finger by finger. Then she looked directly at Janice and asked in a voice so even it made the whole house seem to hold still, Who changed the locks on this property? Nobody answered. Eleanor opened the file. I represent the Mercer Family Residence Trust, she said. Created and executed by Ruth Ann Mercer on January the 14th of this year. The room went so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator motor kick on in the kitchen. Janice laughed once thin and surprised. What trust? Eleanor drew out a set of papers clipped and tabbed. The trust that places this property under protected control with Mr. Walter Mercer as controlling beneficiary and sole residential authority during his lifetime. I did not move. I knew Ruth had gone with Eleanor to straighten out some paperwork in January. Ruth had said that was what people did when they got old enough to know better. I had offered to go. She told me to stay home and wait for the furnace man, because one of us needed to supervise something in this family. At the time, I thought she meant the usual things. Savings, medical forms, maybe the car title. Not this. Not this. Eleanor turned one page and continued. Mrs. Mercer left very explicit instructions regarding outside interference access changes and unauthorized handling of household contents. Outside interference. I felt the words in my chest like a bruise being pressed. Janice's face had gone colorless. Ruth wouldn't have done that without telling us. Eleanor looked at her over the top of the papers. She did not engage me to tell you. Then she turned to me. Her expression changed, softened by only a fraction. There is also, she said, reaching into the file again. A personal letter your wife left for you, Mr. Mercer. She held out a sealed envelope with Ruth's handwriting on the front. For Walt. Nobody in the room said a word. Nobody in the room said a word. I took the envelope from Eleanor with both hands. Ruth's handwriting had always leaned a little to the right, neat but not precious. She wrote grocery lists the same way she wrote sympathy cards and Christmas tags. She believed in saying things clearly and leaving enough room in the margins to breathe. Seeing my name there in blue ink with that plain little W, she always made too wide, nearly did me in worse than the cemetery had. I slid one finger under the flap. Janice said too fast, Walt. Maybe you should read that later. I looked up at her. There are moments when a person finds out the old arrangement has ended. Not because somebody yells, not because a fist hits a wall, just because the room no longer bends the way it used to. For once, I said, you can wait. My voice sounded strange to me. Not loud, not angry, just finished. I opened the letter. Walt. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I hate that thought more than I know how to write. I am also going to write something plain because you have spent too much of your life standing in rooms where plain things were made muddy. This house it is yours to live in, keep and decide over for as long as you please. Not because I am giving you something that was mine to give, but because it has been yours with me all along. You built most of what mattered in it. You kept it standing. You kept me standing too. If anyone tries to make you feel temporary here after I am gone, they are wrong. I had to stop there, not because I could not see, because I could. My eyes went to the kitchen doorway, the counter, the dish towel missing from the oven handle, the space by the refrigerator where Ruth's recipe box ought to have been. All at once, the whole ugly shape of the afternoon pulled tight and showed itself. Janice had not just moved fast. She had come for the one thing she believed I could not defend without Ruth standing beside me. Only Ruth was standing beside me. Not in the room, not in the way a man gets greedy for after a funeral, but there in the clearest way she knew how. I kept reading. I did not tell Janice or the others the details because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. They would call it concern. They would call it help. They would say you were tired or grieving or not thinking clearly. They have been explaining you to yourself for years, and I am ashamed I let as much of that pass as I did in the name of peace. You are not confused. You are not less than. You are not to be managed out of your own life. Mrs. Pike knows what to do. Put the recipe box back where it belongs. Love, Ruth. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the refrigerator humming and somebody breathing through their nose too hard. Maybe me. I folded the letter carefully along the same crease and held it against my palm. Janice spoke first. Of course she did. This is ridiculous, she said. But there was no weight in it now. Nobody was managing him out of anything. Ruth was sick. We were all under strain. We were trying to help. Eleanor shut the file and rested one hand on top of it. Changing the locks on a protected residence without authority is not help, Ms. Holloway. Janice turned to her. You don't know this family. No, Eleanor said, but your sister-in-law did. That one landed harder than anything so far. Janice's face changed. Not dramatically. Janice was not built for dramatic. But something tightened and thinned. She looked older all at once and meaner. She shouldn't have done legal work without telling us. I let out a breath through my nose. There it was. Not grief, not worry. Us. I looked at David. He was standing by the dining room arch with both hands hanging useless at his sides. He would not meet my eyes. That hurt too in its own smaller way. Men like David do damage by vacancy. They let a wrong thing happen, one quiet inch at a time, until there is no clean way to pretend they did not see it. Then I looked back at Janice. You had my lock changed while I was burying my wife, I said. She opened her mouth. I held up one hand, and for the first time in my life, she stopped. You packed my clothes in boxes and set them on the porch, I said. You walked into Ruth's kitchen and started deciding what stayed where. You wrote up a paper for me to sign before I got home, and then you stood there and told me I couldn't stay in my own house tonight. My voice never rose. That was the best part of it, maybe. Or the saddest. I had spent so many years swallowing words that when they finally came, they came clean. Janice tried one more time. Walt, you were in no shape. I was in grief, I said. Not gone. The room went still again. I stepped past her, then, not fast, not rough, and walked into the kitchen. The place looked wrong in all the small ways that hurt most. Cabinet doors not shut flush. A stack of condolence cards where Ruth would never have left them. Her blue Pyrex dish drying crooked in the rack. Somebody had moved the sugar canister 2 inches left of where it had sat for 20 years. Which is the kind of thing only sounds foolish until it happens in a house where one person has just died and another is being quietly removed. I found the recipe box on the dining room buffet. Ruth's wooden box was walnut-scarred on one corner, where I dropped it in 1989 when we were repainting the kitchen and I was trying to carry too much at once. She kept the everyday cards in front and the holiday things in the back. Chess pie, spoon bread, baked beans for church suppers, the chicken casserole her mother made with canned mushrooms and too much sour cream, which I never liked, but always ate. I carried the box back into the kitchen and set it down beside the refrigerator where it belonged. Nobody stopped me. When I turned around, Janice was still in the hallway, arms folded hard enough to make herself look held together. You always do this, she said quietly. You wait until everybody else has to step in, then act insulted. That might have worked on me yesterday. Maybe even this morning. Not now. No, I said. What I did was leave room for family. What you did was mistake that for permission. Her eyes flickered then. Just once. That was the first true thing I had seen on her face all day. Eleanor cleared her throat. Mr. Mercer, if you wish, I can call the sheriff's office and have the lock issue documented formally. Given the trust language and the unauthorized interference that would be appropriate. Janice turned pale. You would call the sheriff on family? I looked at her for a long moment. Earlier that afternoon, she had stood in my doorway and used the word family like a club she had inherited. As if family meant her deciding and me adjusting, as if my marriage had ended and left a vacancy she was entitled to fill. I could have done it. I could have said yes to Eleanor and watched the whole thing go colder and more public. Part of me wanted to. Not for punishment, for record, for the clean, hard satisfaction of consequences. But Ruth had known me better than that. What I want, I said, is for every box to come back inside. I want my old lock put back on tonight, or a locksmith here first thing in the morning with me standing there. I want every dish and card and paper left where it is, unless I move it. And I want everybody who doesn't live here to leave. Janice stared at me. You'd really put your own sister out. I thought about that. The nerve of it almost made me smile. No, I said. You put yourself out when you decided my wife dying made me easier to move. David shut his eyes for a second. Then he walked to the porch, picked up the first box, and carried it inside. He did not say a word. Denise came from the dining room and took another. Small, embarrassed motions, the kind people make when the truth has already arrived, and all that is left is to start undoing what they can reach. Janice stood there a moment longer. Then she turned, took her coat from the hook by the door and said, "You're making this uglier than it needed to be." Ruth's letter was still in my hand. I said, "No, I'm just not helping you make it prettier." That did it. She looked at me like she wanted one last argument and could not find a door into one. Then she walked out. The house did not become peaceful right away. Real life almost never gives you that much theater. There was the sound of boxes coming back over the threshold. The scrape of David setting the old lock hardware on the hall table after finding it in Larry's toolbox in the trunk. Eleanor asking me low and professional whether I wanted copies first thing tomorrow. Denise apologizing without quite using the word. The front porch light burning on while the evening settled in. By 8:30, they were gone. Eleanor left last. At the door, she touched my arm lightly and said, "Your wife was very clear, Mr. Mercer." "I know," I said. After she pulled away, I locked the door myself. Then I stood in the kitchen a long time. I put the sugar canister back, moved the condolence cards to the sideboard, hung the dish towel where Ruth kept it striped side out. I did not do much, just enough to make the room tell the truth again. The coffee in the pot was old from morning, but I warmed a cup anyway. Sat down at the table under the little lamp over the nook. Ruth's recipe card for chicken and dumplings was still tucked in the front of the box. Her handwriting faded a little at the edges from years of being handled. Outside Maple Street had gone quiet. One car passed slow. Somewhere down the block a dog barked twice and quit. The furnace came on with its usual rattle. The house settled around me in the sounds I knew better than my own breathing. I set Ruth's letter beside my coffee and laid my hand over it. I was back inside. That was the plain fact of it. Back in my chair, back under my roof. Back in the life we had made, though not in the way I wanted it, not with her feet in the hallway, and her cardigan over the pantry chair, and her voice asking whether I'd remembered to turn off the porch light. Justice does not bring back the dead. It does not make a family decent just because the papers say they were wrong. What it does, when it comes clean, is stop the lie from settling into the furniture. The coffee cooled while I sat there. After a while, I pulled the recipe box closer, slid the card free, and read Ruth's neat blue handwriting again under the warm yellow light in the kitchen she had told me to keep.